Okay. Let me just talk to you, give you a bit of background about where this talk's come from. So, I used to work in the Cootamundra district with Murrumbidgee CMA, and we did a lot of drought lot work where we were working with landholders and offering landholders incentives to actually put these things on ground. And we were actually very busy with some of those early adopters back in 2007, 2008. We put a lot of lots on the ground. So when I've had a few roles in the Murrumbidgee CMA, and then when LLS happened, I got a role as a mixed farming officer, and it was an opportunity for me to actually go back and have a look at how these things had been had operated on farm. So I actually jumped at that opportunity, and it was also sort of part of our monitoring and evaluation as part of the programs that we deliver on as incentives. So this is where it's come from. I'm assuming I just do that.
Right button, yeah, and the button above it's a red pointer if you like.
Yeah, and also wanted to talk to the farmers who had put the drought lots on. They had all done Stockplan training and wanted to know about their experiences with Stockplan training. So that's pretty much the background of where this has come from. Okay. So what I did was I went back and visited 22 of the early adopters. Most of these drought lots were put on in the years 2007, 8 and 9. And the average farm size was about 1,000 hectares, give or take, with an average midwinter DSC of 7.5 to 15. Interestingly enough, when I spoke to these guys, they'd just come through 10 years of pretty reasonable dry period. They were maintaining their stocking levels. Not many were actually trying to build stocking levels. So I was sort of happy where they were at. These guys had all partaken of the Stockplan training, and some had received some amount of incentive funding to then go ahead and construct a lot, help construct a lot. And I'm assuming that's the pointer, which is the point. Yeah, sorry. So, and that was basically the breakdown. So some were sheep only, some were beef only, but most of them were mixed farmers. So they had a combination of livestock enterprises and also cropping on the farm. So that was basically who I went to see. Tended to be around that Junee, Cootamundra, Harden area. That was the most where the ones who had been early adopters. Okay, so why were farmers interested in putting these things on the property, and why were we, as a primarily environmental organisation, interested in putting them on properties or helping farmers put them on properties? So from our point of view, anything that takes pressure off soils and pastures is a good thing. So that has a lot of off-farm benefits. If you're not exposing soil, you don't get erosion, you don't get in-stream sedimentation. So there's good reasons from an environmental point of view why we'd be interested in helping farmers take pressure off their pastures and their soils during dry times. So that was our reasons why we would fund them, and then we would put public funds into helping people construct drought lots. So also, just if you've got native pastures and you're not actually having an impact on native pastures during dry times, you're actually increasing the biodiversity of the property over time as well. So that's sort of our reasonings why. In the paper there's quite a bit of detail on this motivations for why people do things, but I'll just give you the summaries and then I'll give you the lessons learnt afterwards. Okay. So why were farmers doing it? Basically, the main reason is this one. So the need to maintain cord breeding stock during dry times. Yeah, as you know, once you develop up a breeding line that you're pretty happy with, if you actually sell them off, it's very hard to get that up. It takes years to develop up animals that you want to maintain. If you're forced to sell during dry periods, then it can take a long time to get that back. So this was basically, I asked them the question through these whole series of statements and got them to rank them. That was pretty much it. Pasture, soils and maintaining livestock were the main reasons why they were wanting to do these things. Usually, you know, they weren't that interested about sort of all farm benefits that these things were having. We were. they weren't. That doesn't matter. We were both getting outcomes and we were both happy with those outcomes. So, all right, so things to consider. So when I went around and I looked at all these drought lots and I asked them, you know, what things would they do differently, how they'd modified things over time, you know, as they'd been using them and stuff. So there was a whole heap of really valuable lessons that came out of that I learnt going forward for any new programs that we might do. So one of the things is that conventional wisdom says that, you know, animals in these livestock, these confinement areas, or basically feeding areas, don't need shelter or shade. And the farmers, a lot of them I spoke to, were actually really concerned about that. They were saying, you know, it'd be nice to have some sort of shade in there with the livestock. They seem to be under some sort of stress. Now, livestock studies say that that's not generally the case. They generally seem to cope fine in these lots. But, so what we were encouraging farmers to do was this sort of thing. I don't know if you can see, but this is a lot. It's got trees that have been planted on this side and obviously a bank of trees in here. So we're saying it's a good thing to put shade and protection in association with the lot, but don't put it actually in the lot itself. When you start to put any sort of trees or anything, or if you include existing trees into these things, they'll be dead. They'll be gone in at least 12 months once you start to use the lot itself, because if the livestock don't ring bark them, they'll actually be dead from nutrient overload that happens that you get in these lots. So, and a lot of people had done this sort of thing in their design, but they were saying, oh, look, it's taking ages for these trees to grow. And it's just one of those things. If you get your lot built, or if you decide to build a lot, get the trees in early, get them up, because when you need to use it, you know, I'll offer you some protection. So that was a pretty important lesson learnt. Having spoke to people afterwards, I mean, and I know of a guy over at Harden who actually runs his own commercial lot. It's nothing to do with us, and he has put his own sort of shade structures up, but they can cause their own problems. So if you do consider putting shade structures up, you've got to be aware that you can end up creating a micro-humidity that will actually cause you animal health problems. So if you decide to do something like that, you just got to be careful about how you do it and seek some advice. And there are some designs about how you incorporate sort of shade structures. The other issue you can get with shade structures like this, if they're not big enough, you'll end up with all the animals trying to get underneath them, and you can end up with smothering issues. So there's a few things like that you need to consider. What else do I want to say on the shade front? No, yeah. So the other thing is, when we offer incentives, we go out, we look at the site, and if there's veg, actually or trees or something in the location, we encourage farmers to move the location of the pens so that the vegetation is on the outside. Simply for that reason, it's a great idea. You want to give your stock some shade, but I've seen it too many times where people have put these things on their own properties without any sort of assistance from us, and every tree that's in that lot has been ring barked, and I've seen quite a few examples of that, of sort of drought lots set up in that regard. Okay, water. Yeah, water is actually, and if you look at the paper, water is one of the most important considerations when you're putting a drought lot in. First thing is you need reliable, good quality and high volume water that's flowing into these things, into the lots. The reason for that is livestock can do without feed for a little while, but they cannot do without water. So you've got to have the volume coming in. The other thing is that if the volume or the flow rate's too low, you can have issues with, stocks mobbing the troughs and issues like that. So you've got to have good volumes. The other thing is, when you're planning a drought lot or deciding whether you want to put one on your farm, you need to know that you've got that reliable water flow, because you guys know that when we go into dry times, sometimes it can be hard to get good quality water. Some bores will go saline, your dams will dry up. So they're really important considerations in the initial planning for these things. There's a few things about how you can design your troughing. So things like this look okay, But the reality is, sometimes these short troughs, you'll end up with stock sort of dominating the water source, and then you can have issues with other stock not being able to get accessed. Oops, sorry. It doesn't go back. Anyway, yes, it does. No, we're good. So they can actually dominate these water sources, and then you can have health issues there from lack of water. The other thing is cleanliness. Like these things, the water source has got to be clean, particularly in these situations, because young sheep particularly will be hesitant to drink from troughs with a lot of algae and stuff in them. So the blokes I spoke to said you're cleaning troughs pretty much every day. So, and there's a few of you here. So would you agree that troughs have got to be done almost every day once they're in the trough, in the pens themselves? Also, sometimes when you've got troughs sitting out from a fence like this, you can have issues. They'll get in them. You'll come down and you'll have lambs and things in these troughs. So some people have come up with this idea, which is basically 6-inch PVC piping with a float in it and just a cutout out the top. So, and this has a couple of benefits. A, they can't get in it. And the other benefit it has is that you get a high turnover of water. The water doesn't get as dusty or as dirty or as algae. And they're quite easy to clean because you just unscrew the cap, run a mop or something down the centre of this thing, and they're very quick. And you don't lose a lot of water when you're actually cleaning them either. So that's been quite an ingenious way to get around some of those troughing issues. But if you do something like this, you really do need a high flow rate, because it's relying upon that turnover of the water, because there's not much volume actually held in the trough itself. The other thing is you need to check that you don't have problems, because obviously there's not a lot of reservoir there, and if you run out of water, you're not going to know about it, or the stock are going to go without very quickly. So what else can I tell you? Okay, so some of the general principles we look for when we go out and we do site visits, when we're looking at negotiating putting one of these things on the farm, are important for us, but they're also important for anybody who's thinking about this stuff. So there's a few quite important lessons learned here. So slope, about where you locate these things, is actually quite important. You don't want anywhere completely flat. You would think maybe flat's better, but flat is an issue because you'll end up with more moisture being retained on the site. You need a little bit of slope, but you don't want too much slope. If you have too much slope, you'll end up with quite bad erosion in the actual lot itself. So slope is an issue. You want to just on a gentle slope. The other thing we'll do is, if somebody's a bit limited on their siting, so they've got a lot of slopey areas and not much sort of gentler areas, we'll say use the slopier area, but make sure you've got a buffer at the base of the drought lot to actually pick up some of that nutrient and that will actually come off that drought lot. Vegetation, like I said before, make sure there's nothing in the lot, because it'll be dead within 12 months of you using that actual lot. Access to yards, access to feed are really important. So what you'll find is if they're closer, you'll be able to handle the stock a lot better. I had one bloke, he said, I love my drought lot. It's been really useful during dry times, but the problem is it is right over the back of the property. So when he has to bring him in to do anything with him, it's a royal pain, because they've got to come right back over the other side of the property. But most people have actually located them fairly close to yards and other things, but that is definitely one. Think about accessibility to your existing infrastructure. Access to feed, silos, hay sheds, the like, is important. If your drought lot's on one side of the creek and your feed's on the other side of the creek, and heaven forbid the creek goes up and you can't access feed, then it's an issue. You actually need to be able to think about these things, because you won't always be using them during dry time. Sometimes you might be using them during in winter, and if you have a dry winter and then all of a sudden you get a bit of moisture and your creek goes up. So that is actually important. The other thing we consider important is distance to the house. So I have one bloke who again loves his drought lot, but it is right near the house, and he used it fairly extensively, I think in 2008, and it was driving him batty, and his wife batty. So you really need to make sure that it's not within a distance of the house, so that you can hear, or because you get constant noise, you'll get a bit of dust, and you'll also get a bit of smell. But mostly the noise is the issue with that. The other thing we will look at when we go out and look at these things is distance to your neighbour's house. So I had one fella, God love him, the drought lot wasn't going to be anywhere near his house, but it was going to be right near his neighbour's house, and I mean literally right near his neighbour's house. I said, no, I don't think we can do that. We need to find another site. So we looked around and we found another site. The other thing, the same person, it was right near quite a main road, and although, you know, they're a good thing, put drought lots in, there is a perception in the public where they see a lot of animals herded up into an area that you know, that perception is sometimes reality or in people's minds. So we try to avoid main roads. Country roads where everybody knows what's going on is fine, but main roads, we try to avoid those as well. But if we can't, and we have put them quite close to other main roads, then we'll strategically put tree lines up, etc. So there's ways around things we usually find. Okay, so things to consider. So design, and I'll show you some designs in a minute. Design is important. It's got to work for you. And when we talk about designs, everybody has done something a bit differently. But there are a few principles that I find, you know, work quite well. So we'll talk about that in a sec, and I'll show you some, or one. The other thing is, when you start to use the lots themselves, livestock, whether it be cattle or sheep, have got to be trained in and trained out. So it's like anything you do when you're changing diet. If you change their diets too quickly, you're going to end up with problems. So basically with cattle, you start off with a mix of grain and hay. More hay to start with, less grain, and you slowly increase that over a period of about a couple of weeks until you get more grain than hay at the other end. And that seems to work quite well. So if you do that over sort of 2 to 3 weeks, then you avoid most issues. With sheep, what you do is you start off basically with small amounts of grain, and you slowly increase the grains on a daily rate for the first couple of weeks. And then you get to a stage where you can feed them quite high levels of grain. So originally you're starting off with very small amounts up to, and then at the end you're up to about 1 kilo per head, and that can be done every 2 to 3 days. But they've got to be fed every day small amounts to start off with to avoid any sort of grain poisoning. The other thing is, if they haven't recently been vaccinated, they really need, and it's like with everything, when you change their diet, they need to be vaccinated going into a lot if they haven't been recently vaccinated. Feeding out when and how, well, that's basically falls into the design category, and I'll talk about this in a minute. So this is a design that is for one that we will be funding under the current round of funding, so this year's round, so it hasn't actually been implemented. But I used it because it's quite a good design. Then a common one that we find now is that people will have a series of pens in which they keep the livestock, and then they'll have a feed out area up the top. Sometimes it will be a combination of pen, so there'll be 4 pens. But the principle is the same. The idea is don't feed out where the livestock are. So people say that what they found was when they were trying to feed out in the pens, they were running over sheep, and they were having all sorts of problems. The best idea is to either have a designated feed out pen, or what you do is you rotate the stock through. So you always have one pen empty, put the feed in, put the stock from that pen into there, and then you feed into that one, then you put etc. Or you do this system here where you have a feed out pen and then you just open the gates and let them in to feed. And that seems to work pretty well. It avoids all those issues of you running over sheep, which is a pain because you've costing you a fortune to keep them alive. You don't want to be running them over. The other thing is a couple of other little design things. This one's quite good because what you'll find is you'll end up with shy feeders regardless, no matter what happens. There'll just be animals that just don't do well in these confined areas. So, and these guys will always hang back. So if you're letting the stock through, they're going in to feed, and you've got gates at the back, you can actually push those shy feeders out and then go and put them on a paddock somewhere where they'll do a bit better. So that's quite a good design to incorporate. The other thing is most blokes, and we'll talk about feeding out in a minute, is no. All right, so yeah, I'll wrap it up. But the other thing is most people are feeding on the ground. They've bought troughs, they've bought long sort of trail feeding temporary troughs, but what they found in the end is the most important thing is to get a long length of trail to feed on, because otherwise you'll end up with the bullies dominating feeding out points, particularly lick troughs, etc. So and they've just found that it's just easier to to feed on the ground. Basically, drought looks like a bunch of fences and wire. There's nothing very special about them when you actually see them. We'll forget about that. Stockplan training, which I talked about, is a really good way of coming up with your design and also working out what rations and how to feed. So that training as part of our incentive is always you have to do it. It's a one-day course, very useful. I won't talk about that. And there's various resources around where you can get information about these things. But my take-home message is, and this actually leads on from Bill's talk, drought lots are about managing risk. Not one person I've spoken to has regretted putting them in. They've found them really useful. They'll use them for short periods during short dry periods or longer periods. And when they're not being used for drought feeding, they've got the ponies in them or they've got the rams in them or whatever. It's another piece of farm infrastructure that is quite useful to have. And a final message, if I may, is that we're basically, the Riverina LLS is going through their development up of projects for this financial year. So I suspect we will have some funding for drought lots again. I can't promise you that, but I suspect we will, and it'd be worthwhile keeping your eyes out on our website for when we announce what the funding's going to be, if you're at all interested, because we will help with some amount of construction.
Thank you very much, Janelle.
No worries.
Just like you all to join me in thanking Janelle.
Cheers.